children are very intuitive. We would pick up all those conditionings of our parents. Any trauma at those younger ages can manifest itself in so many different ways. As we always say, the first 5 years of a child's life are so important because we set the basis of what comes next. The brain is the fastest growing part of the body, so really the first 5 years is foundational. There could have been trauma there. And children try and build this picture of inclusivity, don't they? That everything's okay. You know, because when they experienced when it wasn't okay and they had that sense of something isn't right, their parent at that time would have said, no, don't worry, everything is okay. But of course, children are very intuitive, especially at this age. You know, it's only when we get slightly older or when we get adulterated, we lose that intuitiveness quite a lot. So when they're young like this and there's this pretense that everything is okay, the child can manufacture sort of their own happiness around this, which is quite natural and quite normal with children with trauma. We often take those impressions with us to the teenage years, particularly. That's when they're most difficult, because if we all remember as teenagers, they are difficult years. And the reason they're difficult is because this is the final stage of the brain growing. The prefrontal cortex, so the bit across here, is the last thing to form. So the brain is continually forming, but because this area then forms later in our teenage years, and this area is responsible for self-awareness. You know, when we're younger, we role model on our parents, of course. This is how naturally we learn to live in the world. But we would pick up all those conditionings of our parents, good and bad. Yep. So we know the likelihood that if you were brought up with an alcoholic parent, the chances of you becoming an alcoholic are raised greatly. And we see, and sometimes that is what is termed the sins of the father, that they get passed down to the child. Because for the child, that's normal. That's what they grew up with, that's what they understood, that's what they saw, and for them it seemed like normality. Especially at those teenage years, which can start 12, 13 upwards. You know, the child has a lot more self-awareness and begins questioning what they've learned. It's like, well, the world says this and you say this. I'm confused because immediately there's a contradiction. You know, you're telling me to be good and they're having much fun being bad out there. So that's why we struggle with our children, don't we, when they're teenagers. But generally speaking, if they've had a loving, secure upbringing where it doesn't have to be money or wealth, as long as they've had that love, because that love gives them security, they will often evolve into good adults without serious problems. But we know it's a known fact that any trauma at those younger ages can manifest itself in so many different ways, through insecurity, through anger. It can be, if your parents were angry people, you're probably going to have to deal with that anger yourself, because we learn these things. Now, what we will say in Phaisu is true maturity is not always dependent on age. I have met many 70, 80-year-olds who I consider to be immature in their thinking, in the way they acted in certain situations, that they had never, there were still those influences from their parents, and of course from certain things from society, that they'd never been able to evolve past, etc. So on this path, when we meditate, we find a new level of maturity that is much more solid. It's based on that inner experience, that inner joy, that inner love. And therefore, we act better because we're thinking better. So it goes back to that very important point: right thinking, right action. Because we know that if we see trouble around us with people, you often go and look at how they're thinking, and you will see some imbalances there. And of course, then you will see that their actions are unbalanced as well because of that unbalanced thinking. So through meditation, we have that greater self-integration. Therefore, that creates over time a greater spiritual maturity. And really, that spiritual maturity simply means that we're standing firm on that foundation. So many people today do not stand on any form of solid foundation. They can waver in their decisions. They show fragmentation, which means you can think something, say something, and do something all contrary to each other in the same moment. Discipline is good. Many children who are not well disciplined don't feel loved. You see children but I've seen it so many times over the years. These children are they're naughty, the parents weren't able to discipline them sufficiently. And then when they get even into teenage time or adulthood, they turn around and say, I didn't feel loved. Because that discipline is a form of love, but obviously not overbearing, okay? Not overbearing, but just keeping them within those barriers that they can blossom well. That's the important thing. But yes, we are definitely affected by our experiences, in the past that we take into adulthood with us. But as we said, through spiritual unfoldment, we can overcome any of those. There are no barriers to hold us back.